In an ultimate act of love, Carter underwent surgery to donate a kidney to his ailing wife, Jenna, expecting nothing in return but more years of happiness together. However, the discovery of Jenna's affair just months after the life-saving procedure left him reeling with betrayal and disbelief. But it was Carter's next decision that would stun everyone to their core, unveiling a depth of vengeance no one saw coming. Carter stared at the glossy, big envelope on the kitchen counter. The return address was a prestigious law firm in the city, one he had contacted days after learning about Jenna's betrayal. Taking a deep breath, he slid his finger under the seal, breaking it with a satisfying tear. Inside, the documents were as cold and formal as the decision he had made. This lawsuit would change everything. Jenna found him later that evening, poring over the papers. Her face paled when she read the name of the famous law firm in big, bright letters. "Carter, what is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carter didn't look up. "It's exactly what it looks like," he said, his words clipped and final. The news of the lawsuit spread like wildfire. Friends and family who had rallied around Jenna during her illness were now whispering about her behind closed doors. In public, their gazes were tinged with a curious mix of sympathy and judgment. Jenna felt the weight of every stare, her guilt growing with each silent accusation. At the law firm, Carter's lawyer laid out the strategy. "It's not just about the infidelity," he explained, tapping the stack of documents Carter had provided. "It's about what you sacrificed and the binding commitments Jenna failed to uphold." Carter nodded, his expression a mask of determination. He was ready to go to war, a war he felt he had no choice but to win. Jenna hired her own attorney, a recommendation from a friend who promised that he was both sympathetic and ruthless. When she met him, his first question was not about the affair, but about her health. "How are you feeling, physically?" he asked, his eyes keenly observing her. Jenna was taken aback by the question, but she realized that how she played her vulnerability might be her only defense. The community was divided. Some saw Carter as a vindictive husband, others as a victim of a grave injustice. Local newspapers caught wind of the story, and soon the personal conflict was headline news. "Local man sues cheating wife after kidney donation," read one headline, simplifying the complex marriage into one sensational tagline. As Jenna read the articles, her heart sank further. The public narrative was turning against her, painting her as the villain in a tragic love story. At the grocery store, at the bank, people she knew looked away, whispered, and pointed at her. She felt shunned in her own town. The stigma of her actions clouded her every day. Carter, on the other hand, found an unexpected sense of support. Men from his office clapped him on the back, praising his courage and determination. "You're setting an example, man," one colleague said. "You can't let someone just walk all over you." Each affirmation steeled his resolve, but late at night, doubt crept in, whispering that revenge might not bring the peace he sought. During a pre-trial hearing, Jenna caught a glimpse of Carter across the courtroom. He was talking to his lawyer, probably discussing some last-minute details. She noticed how his jaw was set, his eyes hard and unyielding. Gone was the man she had married, replaced by a stranger. The judge called the courtroom to order, and as the room hushed, Jenna's heart pounded in her ears. This was more than a legal battle. It was the dismantling of the past they shared, piece by piece. As the hearing began, Jenna felt a chilling realization. The Carter she knew and loved was truly gone. Her marriage was well and truly over. There would be no coming back from this. Jenna left the courtroom, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridor to the bathroom. Inside, she leaned heavily against the cool, tiled wall, trying to catch her breath. The sterile scent of the bathroom mixed with the lingering tension from the courtroom. The privacy of the space gave her a moment to regroup, but her reflection in the mirror was a reminder of the battle still ahead. The hearing was brutal. Each statement from Carter felt like a deliberate strike, his eyes never meeting hers, his voice steady and devoid of any warmth. Jenna sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, as the room filled with the echoes of their fractured past. Carter's indifference cut deeper than any words could, marking the distance between what was and what could never be again. She slumped against the tiles once more, her breaths shallow and quick. Jenna could feel the stress of the courtroom suffocating her, pressing in from all sides. The cold tile against her skin was the only real thing in that moment, grounding her as the room seemed to spin with whispered legalese and muffled footsteps. Between bathroom breaks, Jenna watched Carter from a distance. He was a fortress of calm, meticulously arranging his notes, consulting quietly with his lawyer. His deliberate avoidance of her gaze spoke volumes. Each time their eyes might have met, he turned away, reinforcing the chasm that had grown between them with calculated indifference. Returning to the courtroom, Jenna tried to steel herself against the weight of the eyes upon her. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, but her confidence faltered under the scrutinizing gazes of the crowd. As she took her seat, the reality of her isolation within the community and the courtroom pressed down on her, making her feel smaller, lonelier than before. Carter stood up, clearing his throat before beginning his methodical recount of their shared history. "Your Honor," he started, his tone detached. "Our marriage, her illness, my donation, her betrayal." He laid each fact down like a brick, building a wall between them. His voice didn't waver, his face showed no emotion. He was presenting a case, not sharing a life story. "As you can see," Carter continued, gesturing to the timeline of events projected behind him, "my sacrifices were significant." He spoke of his generosity, the hardship of the kidney donation, contrasting sharply with Jenna's subsequent actions. And yet, despite everything, his words hung in the air, painting him as the martyr, wronged yet steadfast. He sifted through their past with a cold precision, turning their shared moments into evidence. "There was no room for error in our vows," he said, each word slicing through the room, stripping away any warmth from their history. The legal terms felt harsh, leaving the story of their life bare and bleak. Carter's recount of the affair was chilling. And then, mere months after the surgery, his voice filled the room, every eye fixed on him as he detailed Jenna's actions with clinical accuracy. The silence was heavy, only the sound of his voice recounting the betrayal, making everyone in the room feel the gravity of her decision. Jenna sat frozen, her expression unreadable as Carter continued to speak. The details of her own missteps echoed off the walls, slicing through any ties that might have remained. She didn't flinch, didn't fidget. She simply stared straight ahead, absorbing the impact of each word as if she were alone in the room. Jenna's gaze swept the courtroom, each face reflecting judgment and curiosity. Meanwhile, Carter's lawyer spoke with ruthless precision, his arguments sharp and unwavering. The weight of each word seemed to press down on Jenna, and she felt isolated, as if she was an exhibit rather than a person. Every nod and murmur from the crowd felt like a direct critique of her choices. Her attorney rose, attempting to shift the narrative. "Consider the immense stress my client was under," he pleaded, trying to draw attention to Jenna's vulnerability. but his words seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier of skepticism, barely making a dent against the well-crafted image Carter's testimony had painted. The room remained unmoved, the jury's faces set in stone. As the hearing dragged on, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly stifling. Jenna could feel the tension like a thick cloud, suffocating and heavy. Silent condemnation hung in the air, almost tangible, as if every breath she took was laced with silent disapproval. The weight of the room's judgment was palpable, pressing in from all sides. The judge finally raised his hand, signaling the end of today's session. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning," he declared, his voice breaking the tense silence. The relief was temporary, as the gravity of the prolonged argument settled over the courtroom. Everyone seemed eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere, yet the unresolved issues hung heavily in the air. As the crowd began to disperse, Jenna walked slowly out of the courtroom, her attorney at her side offering muted words of encouragement. Her shoulders were hunched, her steps heavy. The day had drained her of energy and hope. Each step felt harder than the last. As she reached the courthouse doors, she paused, taking a deep breath, bracing herself for the world outside. Outside, Jenna caught sight of Carter striding towards his car. She dashed across the lot, her voice breaking through the quiet. "Carter!" she called out, her shout echoing off the parked cars. He didn't slow his pace, his focus fixed on reaching his car, the distance between them growing with each step he took. Finally catching up, Jenna reached out, grasping Carter's arm firmly. "Carter, please, we need to talk," she implored. He halted abruptly, his body tense. Her grip on his arm was the only thing keeping him from moving forward, but his eyes, fixed ahead, showed his reluctance to engage. Carter yanked his arm away, turning his cold gaze on her. "Don't," he said sharply. Talking now, it could affect the trial. His voice was a harsh whisper, a clear warning that any conversation was off limits. Jenna recoiled slightly, the chill in his words stinging more than the brisk air around them. "I just need to understand why, Carter," Jenna pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. But Carter stood firm, his expression unmoving, his eyes icy. "There's nothing to understand," he replied, his tone dismissive. Each word widened the gulf between them, his anger and detachment clearly pushing her away. He shrugged off her hand and walked back to his car without looking back. Jenna stood there, her hand still reaching out towards him, the gesture hanging unfinished in the air. The engine roared to life and he drove away, leaving Jenna in the growing dusk, her call unanswered, her heart sinking as the taillights disappeared. Jenna stood motionless, the harsh words from Carter echoing in her ears. His face, once warm and inviting, now held no trace of emotion. It was as if he had become a stranger, his features hardened into a mask of indifference. Jenna's mind raced, but no words came. She could only stare, trying to reconcile this cold figure with the man she had loved. Tears welled up in Jenna's eyes as she gazed at Carter, searching for any sign of the man she once knew. But his face remained impassive, his eyes distant. The parking lot around them felt impossibly large and empty, emphasizing the gulf that had grown between them. Jenna's heart ached as the realization set in that the Carter she loved might be gone forever. "Carter, say something, please," she implored. He just looked at her, his eyes demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. Jenna shook her head slowly, her throat tight with emotion, words failing her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive, as Carter waited, unmoved by her visible distress. Whispered his name. "Carter?" Her voice cracked under the strain of her emotions. He looked at her, his expression unchanged, steely and distant. Her plea hung in the air, unanswered, as if it were too fragile to withstand the coldness in his gaze. Jenna felt a chill as she realized her words had no effect on him. Finally, Jenna turned away, her resolve crumbling. Tears streamed down her cheeks, each one a silent testament to her pain and defeat. As she walked away, she heard Carter's footsteps fading in the opposite direction. The sound was a stark reminder of the growing distance between them, leaving her feeling utterly alone in the fading light of the day. Jenna wiped her tears, steadying her voice as she approached Carter again. "Can't we resolve this without the court?" she asked, her voice thick with hope and fear. "Isn't there a chance for us without making everything so public?" She searched his face for any sign of softening, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and faint hope. Carter's laugh was sharp, cutting through the chilly air. "You should have thought of that before," he retorted, his voice laced with bitterness. "It's a bit late for second thoughts, Jenna." His words felt like a slap, dismissing her plea with a stark finality that left her reeling. He shook his head, disbelief and anger evident in his eyes. Without another word, Carter turned on his heel and strode towards his car. Jenna stood there, rooted to the spot, watching him walk away. The finality in his steps echoed the shutting door on any reconciliation. She was left alone, the sound of his diminishing footsteps, a harsh reminder of their fractured past. Jenna watched as Carter slipped into his car and slammed the door shut. The sound reverberated in the empty parking lot, mirroring the closure in his heart. She stood there, the echo of his rejection playing over in her mind, a loop of words and cold dismissals that chilled her to the bone. The cold air swirled around Jenna, her breath visible in the fading light. She stood motionless, the emptiness of the parking lot encapsulating her despair. Around her, the world seemed to move on indifferently. The occasional car passing by, its lights cutting through the twilight. Jenna felt a profound isolation, as if the empty space around her mirrored her own hollowed-out heart. Upon arriving at his temporary residence, Carter wasted no time. He quickly dialed his lawyer, eager to dissect today's proceedings. "We need to go over everything, see where we stand," he said as soon as the call connected. His voice was urgent, filled with a mix of determination and anxiety. The pre-trial hearing had stirred up more emotions and stakes than he had anticipated. Carter sat with his notes spread out before him as his lawyer spoke. "Let's pinpoint our strengths and tighten up where we're vulnerable," his lawyer suggested. They discussed key moments of the hearing, analyzing the impact and reception of each argument presented. The conversation was detailed and methodical, aiming to leave no stone unturned for the next round. "I need to mention she approached me in the parking lot," Carter said, his tone cautious. He explained how he had anticipated such an encounter and had recorded their conversation, following his lawyer's prior advice. "It's all here," he assured, tapping the recorder. The revelation was strategic, hinting at his preparedness for any unforeseen complications. The lawyer's response was immediate and approving. "Good thinking," he commended, his voice firm and focused. "That recording could prove invaluable, showing her state and intentions clearly." He emphasized how this piece of evidence could tilt the scales further in their favor, adding a layer of defense against any emotional appeals Jenna might make. Carter nodded, absorbing his lawyer's advice. "I'll stay on guard," he promised, a new sense of resolve firming his voice. The conversation had bolstered his confidence, reinforcing the notion that he wasn't just reacting anymore, he was acting with intention. As he ended the call, he felt more prepared and vigilant, ready for whatever the trial might bring next. At the second pretrial hearing, Carter confidently stepped forward, a recorder in hand. "Your Honor, I present new evidence relevant to the case," he declared. The room tensed as he played the recording of Jenna's confrontation in the parking lot. Every word amplified through the speakers held the courtroom in a palpable silence, broken only by the play button's click. As Jenna's voice filled the room, gasps echoed off the walls. The crowd turned to stare at her, their faces etched with disgust and disbelief. Jenna shrank under their intense gaze, feeling every word weigh heavily against her. The atmosphere thickened, the recording not just filling the room with sound, but with a wave of judgment. Her lawyer stood abruptly, objecting. "Your Honor, we question the legality of this recording," he protested. But the judge was quick to respond, his voice firm. "Objection overruled. The evidence will stand." Jenna's heart sank as the judge's gavel hit the sound block, the finality of the decision echoing louder than the recording itself. Jenna watched helplessly as her attorney floundered to rebuild her defense. Across the room, Carter's lawyer was relentless, each statement meticulously crafted to chip away at her character. "As evidenced by the recording," he stated coldly, weaving Jenna's own words into a narrative that painted her as the sole architect of their marital discord. The whispers started small but grew in fervor around Jenna. "How could she?" someone murmured. "After everything he did for her." Another added scornfully. The hostility in the room was palpable, each whispered word like a dagger. Jenna felt an overwhelming sense of vilification, as though the room itself were closing in around her, leaving her nowhere to hide from the scornful stares. Jenna's hands trembled as she clicked on the new email from her HR department. The subject line was foreboding enough. Immediate termination notice. The message was curt, citing reputational concerns as the reason for her dismissal. Her heart sank. The repercussions of the public scandal had reached her professional life, severing the last semblance of normalcy she had clung to. In the days that followed, Jenna sent out dozens of job applications, each met with silence or outright rejection. "We appreciate your interest, however," became a phrase she dreaded. The stigma of her public ordeal had tainted her professional reputation, making each interview feel like an insurmountable hurdle. Despair began to set in as doors closed one after another. Walking down the street became an exercise in endurance. People pointed and whispered as she passed, their eyes flicking with recognition and then quickly away in disdain. Laughter, tinged with cruelty, followed her, and rumors swirled like leaves around her feet. Jenna pulled her coat tighter around herself, wishing she could disappear from the judgmental gazes. Each day stretched out like a desolate landscape for Jenna. Her interactions became fewer, her phone quieter. Friends who had once been close now crossed the street to avoid her. With her professional and social prospects dwindling, her world shrank to the confines of her increasingly suffocating home. The walls seemed to echo with the loud silence of isolation. It dawned on Jenna that the town had unequivocally turned its back on her. Everywhere she went, the cold shoulders and averted gazes made it clear. She was a pariah here. This community, once a tapestry of support and camaraderie, had retracted all threads of warmth towards her. Left utterly alone, Jenna realized the full extent of her ostracization, her heart heavy with the burden of her newfound solitude. The trial week kicked off with the courtroom packed, the air thick with tension. Public opinion was fiercely against Jenna, her every move scrutinized and judged harshly. Even her attorney seemed to shrink under the weight of regret. his confidence waning as he realized the magnitude of the public and media backlash. Jenna sensed the overwhelming odds against her, her heart heavy as she faced the crowd's hostile stares. Carter entered the courtroom like a celebrity, greeted by nods and smiles from many in attendance. He was flanked by supporters, their presence a stark contrast to Jenna's solitary figure. Standing tall, he seemed bolstered by the backing, while Jenna gathered her resolve, facing her accusers with a grim determination that masked the turmoil inside. As proceedings commenced, a palpable buzz filled the room, the audience's anticipation clear. This wasn't just another trial day, it was a spectacle. The trial's ruthless nature mirrored the intensity of the pre-hearings, each side presenting their arguments with sharp ferocity. Jenna sat tensely, her focus unwavering as she braced herself for the onslaught of accusations. When Jenna's affair partner was called to testify, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted noticeably. The judge's demeanor became openly hostile towards Jenna, his skepticism evident in every frown and piercing stare he directed her way. The air grew thicker with tension, the audience hanging on to every damning word, their judgment of Jenna deepening. Jenna's lawyer paced nervously, his attempts to construct a robust defense crumbling under the courtroom's bias. Every objection he raised seemed to meet with stiffer resistance, every plea for fairness drowned out by the crowd's murmurs. Jenna watched, her despair mounting as she felt the scales of justice tip increasingly against her. When Jenna's affair partner took the stand, his testimony was laced with desperation, his voice faltering as he tried to deflect blame onto Jenna to save himself. The courtroom listened, but skepticism was evident in the murmurs and shakes of heads. They found his words unreliable, seeing through his attempts to manipulate the truth for his own benefit. Jenna watched, her hope dwindling as she realized even this witness could not sway the public sentiment. In a moment of quiet between the arguments, Jenna locked eyes with Carter across the courtroom. Her gaze was pleading, silently begging for some sliver of understanding or mercy. Her eyes conveyed the turmoil and regret that words had failed to express throughout the trial. She searched his face for any sign of softening, any hint of the love they once shared. Carter met Jenna's gaze, but his eyes were like steel, reflecting none of the emotions she hoped to see. His face remained set, unyielding as if carved from stone, his decision clear in his unwavering stare. As the final arguments were made, the inevitability of the trial's conclusion hung heavy in the air, leaving Jenna with a sinking feeling of finality. The judge delivered the verdict with a stern voice, ruling decisively in Carter's favor. He awarded Carter their house and a substantial sum for emotional damages, citing Jenna's actions as justification for the judgment. Jenna sat numbly, the finality of the decision echoing like a gavel's fall in her mind, stripping her of her last hopes and her home. As the courtroom cleared, the difference in their fortunes was stark. Carter was surrounded by supporters, their cheers and congratulations filling the air, while Jenna faced cold stares and murmured insults. The suggestion was clear and cruel. She should leave town. With nowhere left to turn, Jenna walked out of the courthouse alone, her departure marking the end of her ordeal and her life in the town she once called home.